Good morning. And to think, today I prepared an hour-long sermon for you. Isn't it? No, Paul Mathis, when he preached here, had a joke that he talked so fast that if he wanted to preach for 15 minutes, he would need to prepare about 45 minutes of material, and then he would preach for 15 minutes. I'm more of the 35 to 15 range, but it's the same kind of deal with me. But it's good to be here with you this morning. It's good to be up here. It's good to have a chance to share a little more about service with you. This morning, I want to start our conversation with a talk about leadership. I think leadership is something that a lot of us, maybe not all of us, I don't mean to presume, but a lot of us strive for. A lot of us aspire to leadership, whether it be in our job, where we look for opportunities for advancement, where we look for promotions, where we do things to get more responsibilities, whether it be in our hobbies, our social groups, whatever the case may be. Oftentimes we aspire to grow and to look for more opportunities and to advance in our hobbies or our jobs. Now, the church has leadership too. The church has elders, we have deacons, we have teachers. And a lot of us are either in a role like that or aspire to one day become in a role like that. And I think it's an interesting question for us to examine this morning to why do people want to be leaders? Well, if we look at why the world wants to be leaders, I think oftentimes you find some interesting answers. I think in our jobs, a lot of time it's money, right? We want to advance so we can make more money, so we can have more, so we can do more things. Even if those aspirations are noble, we want to give more away, we look to make more. I don't think many people, if their boss came to them and said, we want to give you a raise, they'd say, no thanks. We aspire to do that. Some people want more power. They want to be able to set the path that their job or their department goes on. They want to have that ability to say, no, we're going to do it this way. They look for power. I think a lot of times we often like to have nobody to answer to, where we don't have to be told what to do, where we can make our own schedule, where we can make our own agenda. I think the world understands these motivations for power. And I think what motivates us, what drives us as leaders or to become leaders, affects our leadership style. I think we've all possibly, maybe in a personal experience, maybe in somebody else's, we've seen a leader where they would do anything to protect their position, where they would make a decision, the decision didn't work out, well, so-and-so told me that was the way it was going to work, so it's really on them. They would do things that may be outside of an ethical set of behavior to protect their position. They would lie, they would pass off ideas, they would do whatever they needed to do to protect that. And I think as we look today and we look this morning at Jesus as a leader, I think we'll see and we'll notice that he led differently. He led different than even his contemporaries, and even still now, his leadership style is a little different than what we're used to. And he calls us to lead differently than maybe the world will tell us to. And for this study, we're going to be mostly in Mark chapter 10. So if you want to flip over to Mark chapter 10, that's where the majority of our time will be spent. We'll move around a little bit, but we'll look first here in Mark chapter 10. And we're going to look at an interesting story, and it's going to be starting in verse 35. And this story is told in a couple of different gospels. We'll talk about a little bit of maybe the differences between them, and we'll study that a little bit further as well. So starting in Mark chapter 10 and verse 35, it says, James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? They said to him, Grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory. Okay, so this story is also told in Matthew chapter 20. But the question in Matthew chapter 20, which may be the one you're more familiar with, is their mother asks for them. The mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, comes to Jesus and asks that he grant her request and says that when you come back in your glory, I want one of my sons on your right, one of my sons on your left. Now, Matthew does say that the sons were there, He does because they respond to Jesus' question right after this. But the request, nonetheless, is the same. We could look at this and say this is a little bit different, but I think the point that Jesus is going to make here, and the point that Mark and Matthew and even Luke mentions the story, the point of the response is the same. So we look at the request here, and the request is to grant that one sit on your left and one sit on your right. And I think history has been hard on James and John here. We've looked at this situation and we've said, well, they were being really selfish. I mean, they were looking for power. They were looking for glory, being very selfish in this situation. And I think that's a little harsh, because if you look at the story of and the history of James and John, they were some of his first followers. They were some of the first people to come with Jesus. And here they're looking for more responsibility. I take this, and again, this is my opinion. I try to separate that from what we say here. I look at this as, can we have a promotion? Can we, when you have your glory, can we sit there at your right and your left? Can we have that responsibility? Can we have that power? Now, why they were asking, I don't think it says, but they were looking for this position. Now, that defense does crumble a bit when you look at their first question. It says, "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask of you." Who has had their child come up to them and say, "Hi, I'd really like you to say yes to what I'm about to ask you"? Now, typically, the response to that question after that is no. And the reason they ask that is because they know that you're going to say no. So why don't you just say yes real quick? So maybe they had some selfish motives in this situation. Again, I don't think we can know that for certain. But let's look at Jesus' response. In verse 38, it says, "But Jesus said to them, 'You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?' They said to him, 'We are able.' And Jesus said to them, 'The cup that I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized.'" So Jesus' first response is, do you know what you're asking for? Do you understand what this request really means? And I think it's a situation here that we can look at and we can understand, because we don't always know what leaders are going through. We don't always know the struggles that they're having. We don't always understand fully the responsibility that's laid on them. And Jesus is saying, do you really understand the responsibility that you're asking for? Do you realize what comes with being right there beside me, to dealing with the things that I deal with? I think I've seen this with some of my bosses, where I've sat in on a meeting with them and I've seen the responsibilities and the work that they've done. I go, wow, I didn't know they were doing all that. And I think Jesus is saying, do you realize what I'm going to have to go through? Are you able to drink the cup that I am drinking from? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism that I am being baptized with? And I think this is a situation that it's the same with church leadership. It's easy for us to criticize leaders. It's easy for us to look and say, well, why are they doing that? What are they doing there? What were they thinking when they made that decision? And we don't always know the issues that they're combating. We don't always know the situations that they're dealing with day to day, whether that be an elder, a deacon, a teacher, whatever leadership role that is. We don't know everything that they are dealing with in that situation. And it is a big responsibility. I think that's a reason that in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul tells him that they receive double honor. In 1 Timothy 5:17, it says, "The elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching," because it's a massive responsibility. So if you do it well, there's double honor to be made in that, but it's a big responsibility. And not everybody's going to know what you have going on. And they're going to criticize you, and they're going to critique you, not knowing the full situation. But still, James and John see this response. They listen to Jesus say this, and they say, "We are able. We can do it. We're willing to drink the cup that you drink from. We're willing to be baptized with the baptism that you're baptized with." And Jesus says that they will. And when we look at history, and we look at James, his demise, his death is captured in Acts chapter 12, written about. In Acts chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Now about that time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword." This is the first apostle martyred in Acts chapter 12. So James did die and give his life for the gospel. If you look at the history of John, he was at one point banished to the island of Patmos. If you look at the history of the island of Patmos, a lot of people who were banished there, a lot of people who were sent there, were used as slave labor. There were mines there, and oftentimes the people that were shipped or banished to that area were used as slave labor. And John was sent there for preaching the gospel. So both did suffer greatly for the gospel. So this is what Jesus was most likely talking about when he says, you will go through the things that I'm going through. And James and John say they will handle it, and they do. Continuing on in verse 40, but to sit on my right or my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. So Jesus says he can't grant this. Again, this is the best I can tell. This is not because it's not an arbitrary decision. It's not something that you just ask for. These are positions that, probably the Father would set apart to be at the right and the left. But Jesus is saying this is not something that I can grant. So then we look at the others, and they are obviously upset by this because a lot of them were there from the beginning as well. It's not like James and John dealt with anything that they hadn't dealt with. And I think thinking back to our worldly example of asking for a promotion, if we're working beside someone, if we're working in the same group and we think that promotions just go to those who work the hardest, but somebody comes and just says, hey, can I have that job? There's a way that we may look at that they've been selfish, that they're looking out for themselves, that they're not going through the proper channels to get that leadership role. And the others do become indignant with James and John. So looking at verse 42, calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. So Jesus here points out how the world views power and authority. He's giving them a real life world example of what it looks like when those who are in authority exercise it. He's saying rulers lord their authority over them. They speak down to them. They tell them what to do. They demand and speak to the people in that way. And the great men, the strong among them, rule. They exercise their authority. And Jesus here is warning against this type of leadership. He says, though you know that those who are recognized as rulers. He warns against this selfish type of leadership. And the warning for church leadership is very similar in 1 Peter chapter 5, where he talks, where Peter is writing, and he says in 1 Peter chapter 5, starting in verse 1, he says, therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, not for sordid gain, but with eagerness. And then in verse 3, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. So Peter's telling them that you're not, if you have a leadership position, if you are an elder of a congregation, you're not to lord it over people. You're not to speak down or demand or deal with the flock in that manner, but you're to act as an example to them. Turning back to Mark, continuing on in verse 43, but it is not this way among you. It's not that like the recognized of the rulers of the Gentiles who lord it over them, but it's not this way among you in verse 43, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be a slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So Jesus here encourages them to be different. He encourages them to not act like these Gentile leaders who lord authority over others. He encourages a radical form of leadership, and that form of leadership is servant leadership. Servant leadership has been adopted in many different business circles. You'll read books about it. You'll see different seminars on how to be a servant leader. But I think the roots of that practice, the roots of this philosophy are in Jesus, are in this section right here where Jesus tells them, but if you want to be great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first shall be a slave to all. Jesus is saying that the best way to lead others is through service. The word for servant here is diakonos. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's used sometimes also for a table waiter. And I thought that was a really interesting word to use there, because when we think about waiters and we think about those who wait on us at restaurants, their needs are not normally something that you know about or even see. They care for your needs rather than their own needs. If you ask for an iced tea and they said, well, the iced tea is on the other end of the shop, there's a Pepsi machine right here, I'm going to get you a Pepsi instead, we would think that would be a little strange. Or we would say, well, we don't want onions on our burger. Well, that takes a couple more pushes of the button. I can't do that. But I'll get you a burger, just it'll have onions on it. You can take it off yourself. We don't think about a table waiter thinking about their own needs, but the needs of those who are waiting on them. And I think when we apply that to our service, when we apply that to the way we lead, I think it's pretty interesting. We don't do just what's convenient. We don't say, well, yes, I'm going to help this elderly woman by cutting her grass, but I really don't want to edge because I don't like that. I'm going to rake their leaves, but I don't really want to put it in bags because that's the annoying part of raking the leaves. We don't think about our service like that. We don't think about just caring for the needs of others and not our own needs or preferences. But that's what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying the servant that I'm requiring doesn't think about their own needs. The leadership that I'm asking you to do doesn't think about yourself. It thinks about the needs of everyone else only. Not their needs first, their needs only. And that's the service that he's calling for. These are the ones that Jesus says will be first. These are the ones that Jesus says should be the leaders. And Jesus, as he does so often, he leads us by example in this. He lived a life of service. And we've talked about this the week before Brother Kerry came in John 13 with the washing of the disciples' feet. This was a humble act of service. This was something that would be seen as beneath the rabbi, the master, the savior that Jesus was. But he did that. He did that out of humility, and that's how he led. And he says, do as I do for you. And Jesus led with a loving service. This interaction in Luke is in Luke chapter 22. And I really like the way that Luke recalls, and it's translated the way he says this response here. In Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 24. And it says, and there arose also a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be the greatest. Again, this is, if we're bringing the story back, it's James and John asking to be at the right and the left, or their mother, or somebody asking for them. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But it is not this way with you, but the one who is greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. For who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. So he's saying, think about it. Who's better, the one who serves or the one who reclines at the table? Isn't that the one who reclines at the table? I mean, this is the worldly philosophy, right? The greater one is the one who's reclining, the one who's being serviced, the one who's directing. But I'm here, Jesus is saying, I'm here to tell you that I want you to be the one who serves. I want you to be the leader who serves others, the leader who looks out to the needs of others rather than their own needs at all. And he asks this question to flip their perspective on the matter. He tells them, if you want to be great leaders, if you want to lead as I have instructed you to lead, serve. So as we look here if we're ready for service, and this is our theme this year, I think we need to look at those who are leaders, those who aspire to be leaders, those who are wanting to be the leaders of this congregation, and thinking, well, how are you serving? What are you doing to serve? Because that's what Jesus says leaders need to do. And that's what they need to do first. They need to learn to serve first before they become leaders. Jesus exemplified servant leadership. And as we continue to look at service, as we continue to look at how we can serve and how to serve better, I think this will have a byproduct of creating more leaders. as we become better servants, we'll grow more leaders, because that's what leaders do. They serve. So if we talk about, leadership in the church, and globally, church leadership has been on the decline just as church membership has. If we want to grow church leadership, if we want to grow people who are going to lead the future generations, who are going to bring more people into Christ, I think we have a pretty good theme to do that. So we need to ask this year, are we ready to serve? And if we're ready to serve, let's do so. And as we're serving, we'll learn to be better leaders and leaders who serve. And it all starts, as I mentioned, with service. If there's anything that we can help you with this morning, if you need the prayers of the church, if you want to become a better servant, we encourage you to come forward this morning. Or if you want to give your life over to Christ, if you want to be baptized into his body and become a member of this congregation,